Hey there, this is the Revelation Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Wes Rothschild Brooks, and thank you again for tuning in to another episode where we talk about the book of Revelation and looking at the Old Testament. You should come away with better clarity about the book of Revelation and look at God's patterns and methodologies and practices. And since He's consistent, we have a better understanding about the book of Revelation and the events of the book of Revelation. Just to let you know, if you haven't already done so, please visit my website, therevelationchristian.com, where you can subscribe and get newsletters to stay up to date with what I find is happening in the world to keep you updated. Or if you want to become a member, you can join and discuss with have discussions with like-minded people, also in the same space and agreement with what I'm sharing and showing about becoming a member. But if you also want to support what I do financially, you can also go to the shop page and you can find and buy Christian apparel that promotes and showcases Jesus and the gospel. And you can also go to the review page. You can leave a donation if you want to do that too. So there's a couple options, a lot that I offer, and I hope you find it informative and beneficial in your walk, in your journey to understand the end time prophecy with learning about Pope Francis, the false prophet, or Princess Solomon bin Talal as a future Antichrist, or the book of Revelation as a whole. So there's a lot to offer there. Now let's continue. So what we're going to do is continue to the next phase of this study, where we're going to talk about what happens next after the exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt into the Promised Land. So eventually we see that Moses is leading them to the Promised Land, and God gives him the Ten Commandments. But he tells Moses to put the Ten Commandments in this spiritual super chest. It's called the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred, iconic treasure of the Middle East of ancient times, the Ark of the Covenant. And it's the most identifying thing and artifact to the Jewish people to this day. It's they bathe in their identity on this particular artifact. Because not only that, it's actually God's throne on earth. It's called the mercy seat. This is where Jesus himself will sit on and rule the earth as he sat on that seat, the mercy seat. Now, when God told Moses to construct this artifact called the Ark of the Covenant, which would house the Ten Commandments, we find that there is a duty that the high priest had, which had to spill the blood of an animal on this ark in order to atone for the sins of Israel once a year. Only the high priest could go into this contraption of this tent. It's called the tabernacle. And inside the tent, there were two places, the holies and the holies of holies. And you had the table showbread, and you had the menorah candle, and you had the altar incense. You had, in the back part of this tabernacle, you had the place where the Ark of the Covenant was. So only the high priest could go back in the back of the, kind of like in the back room of this particular pit. In the front, you had where the priests could go, the servants, my mind just escaped me. Levites, the Levite priests, but then there was the high priest, and all were descendants of Aaron. So what happened, we find after they are constructing this tabernacle and they're putting the Ark of the Covenant into the back of this tabernacle where the sacrifice would be held to atone for the sins of Israel, you see that what happened is God is actually forecasting and shouting what he's going to do with Jesus Christ. Just as an animal was the animal's blood atoned for the sins of the world. The animal's blood atoned for the sins of Israel when the high priest poured the blood on the Ark of the Covenant. You find that God was actually foreshadowing what he was going to do with Jesus. Jesus' blood would be the blood that would atone for the sins of the world. And so this ordinance and this rule, this ritual, this ceremony had to have been practiced in the manner in which God set forth, and that was the animal's blood had to be poured on the Ark of the Covenant. And this is how the high priest practiced it so that the sins will be forgiven over Israel once a year. But now what I want you to take note of is find something happens that in the year 585 BC, we see King Nebuchadnezzar is raised up because after Moses creates this tabernacle, and then Israel calls for a king, and it starts with King Saul, goes to King David, goes to King Solomon. Then it just goes crazy, where all the children after King Solomon and the other kings preceding him, they start becoming so disobedient to God that they turn their back on God. And Israel just became so disobedient that that's the era of the prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and so on. So God is calling these prophets to speak on his behalf to the kings to tell Israel to repent, to change their ways, but they're just so hard-headed they wouldn't do it. And so what we find happen here is that God raises up King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon as a judgment against Israel. And so what we see here is that what he's doing is he's pleading them to change, to humble themselves and change, but they just wouldn't do it. They were so prideful that they were the chosen people of God that nothing would dare happen to them. Little did they know that God would hide his face from Israel. Still being the chosen people, but he would just hide his face from them. And so what happened? Israel ransacked Jerusalem and burnt it to the ground. Took Jewish people back to Babylon, which is commonly known as the Jewish captivity in Babylon, or the Babylonian captivity. And we see that Ark of the Covenant that I told you about, in medieval times, you have to know when there's warfare, the ancients would always ransack the town, city, temples, and take all the treasures, and it'll be the spoils of war. So when Babylonian army went to the temple, oh, I forgot to mention, what temple? The first temple. Remember I mentioned how King David was raised up as the king after King Saul? And King Solomon was raised up as the king after King David. And that tabernacle I mentioned? Well, David couldn't build a temple for the Ark of the Covenant, but his son Solomon could. So Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived and ever will have lived. And there won't be anyone as wise as him. So what we find here is that God gives him the go-ahead to build this temple. And the temple is the most beautiful temple ever seen. And this is where the Ark of the Covenant was held. But as I said again, after another king, and another king, we see that they turned their backs on the Lord. And so King Nebuchadnezzar was raised up to render judgment against them. And so that temple that I told you about, the first temple made by King Solomon, was ransacked. And all the treasures was taken. And I believe this is in 1 Kings. And all the treasures were found and taken back to Babylon. In fact, in the passage where it talks about how Babylon goes and ransacks the temple and takes everything out of it, they itemize it like it's an audit. They mention the spoons, the plates, the candles, you name it. But one thing isn't mentioned in that temple that was taken: the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was not taken by the Babylonians, and it hasn't been seen ever since. It hasn't been seen ever since. But there is another book, the book of Maccabees, chapter 3, which tells us that prophet Jeremiah took the Ark of the Covenant and hid it in an underground chamber to be used for God's purpose at a later time. So we see that the Ark of the Covenant, based on the Maccabees' testimony of what Jeremiah did, hid it. And so this Ark of the Covenant will be hidden and used for another moment in time. Funny enough, the book of Revelation tells us that the Ark of the Covenant will be seen in the future for public display. In Revelation chapter 11, it says that then the temple of God was open in heaven, and the Ark of his covenant was seen in his temple. So we see the Ark of the Covenant will be seen again in the end times, per book of Revelation chapter 17. So going back to the point of what I was saying before, was that King Nebuchadnezzar was taken out. King Nebuchadnezzar was raised up. Jewish people were taken out of Jerusalem, back to Babylon, and they were there for 70 years in Jewish captivity. And there we see one young man that was once a young man, but now he became a older man, became a trusted advisor of King Nebuchadnezzar, Prophet Daniel. So we see this is where we enter to the Daniel prophecies with the book of Daniel, in what vision that he explained that King Nebuchadnezzar had after having a dream of future Jesus returning to rule the planet Earth. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, don't forget to leave me a message. You can email me at west@therevelationchristian.com. All right, talk to you later.